Hey guys, what's going on? So it's almost Halloween and I've just read 3 seasonably appropriate books, some of which I'd recommend, some of which I wouldn't. I bet you've heard of this first one, but I'd be surprised if a lot of you have read it because I barely got through it. Probably should have been a DNF, but it's a classic and I like to test my reading comprehension. I like to test my attention span, but mostly I'm just stubborn. It's Dracula by Bram Stoker. And maybe I'll blow your mind here. Bram is a nickname for Abraham. Maybe that's not mind-blowing, but I thought it was interesting. Y'all know what Dracula is about, and so do I, which is why it was so boring. It doesn't bring a lot to the table besides introducing the idea of Dracula and vampires and how they operate. It's written in this journal style, which doesn't change throughout the entire book. Long, drawn-out descriptions of things I already know. And it's not entirely the book's fault, but reading it from a modern perspective, I already know who Count Dracula is. I know who Count Chocula is. I've seen Mr. Burns as Dracula. It's not a novel idea, so if that's going to be your main selling point, it's not going to work. And if you're going to move the story along at this really slow pace where you're describing people's nostrils as quick and sensitive, which I don't even know what to picture when you tell me that, it's going to be hard for me to get through the book. I don't want to poke too much fun at the book because obviously he introduced vampires. It's a great feat, but I can't help comparing it to Frankenstein, which introduced that concept but still had emotional depth. And while it was slow, it offered a lot of food for thought, even reading it hundreds of years later. But I'm going to assume that the underlying technique here was to suck the life out of the reader as Dracula sucked the life out of people, which was a slow and gradual process like a toad being boiled alive. It wasn't all at once, but just slowly you realize that this book has nothing of value, but you're still reading it because you're stubborn. Anyways, obviously I didn't like this book, but I still have to give it an antiquity bonus, and I still have to give it a seasonal bonus, but even with that, probably can't see giving it more than a 4. But next up, we got another book with vampires, I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. Technically, they're called vampires in this book, but they're really more like zombies. It's a post-apocalyptic book about seemingly the last man alive on Earth. Everyone else has succumbed to this viral infection that turns you into a mindless, blood-sucking drone. The main character is immune, though, so he lives by himself in this house, and every night the vampires come out and just kind of surround him and taunt him and generally depress him. And it's a very Richard Matheson book. It's a very Richard Matheson character. I feel like he encompasses the quote, "Men live lives of quiet desperation." What was that, Oscar Wilde? Hopefully. I don't embarrass myself there. And I'm sure certain women live lives of quiet desperation as well. Just this framework of having so many issues around you and having so many unfortunate things happen, and at the end of the day, it is what it is. That's kind of the mantra of the quietly desperate man. It is what it is. There's nothing you can do about it. You just have to accept life as it is. That's what this man struggles to do, with the help of alcohol, mostly. And I had seen the movie a long time ago. I can't rewatch it for reasons. Oh, wow! And I kept waiting for the dog in this book. Give this guy a ray of sunshine. Give him some hope. Give him some optimism. That's what you're hoping for throughout this book, that he can rise out of this situation, the environment and the mindset, and a dog would help him do that. And then finally, the dog does come into the story and quickly leaves the story, which was a gut punch in an already depressing book. And I won't spoil it any further, but he does take steps towards optimism, towards hope, and it doesn't end well. It's a depressing book, truly. There's a gut punch after gut punch, so maybe not a winter read, maybe not something you want to pursue when you're feeling down. Personally, after Dracula and I Am Legend, I have to find the brightest book on my shelf. But I'm a fan of the post-apocalyptic novel. I'm a fan of Richard Matheson, even though he definitely is too real at times. And I'm honestly a fan of the wet blanket on occasion. So it was a good book as far as I'm concerned. really well paced for the 50s, much like Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. Kind of similar themes there, similar feel to the books. And this edition also included some short stories afterwards, which I read, which cements Richard Matheson as the too real author. All the characters are men that live lives of quiet desperation. But it's good to see that from a third-person perspective and mix it with some objectivity so that I can avoid their fate, which is usually a grisly one. And lastly, we have The Changeling by Victor Lavalle. Haven't heard of this guy, haven't heard of this book, but a viewer sent this to me, and I have a good idea why. The main character in here goes to estate sales, goes to library sales, buys a bunch of used books, and then sells them online. Sounds familiar. He's also a young guy whose wife is pregnant. Sounds familiar. So it was super easy for me to slip into this character. I was engaged right away, which is a good thing, of course, but also a bad thing because they have some tragedies befall them. Tragedies that young parents can hardly fathom because of how difficult it would be. And I was firmly in the perspective of this main character, so it was very emotional for me, a very moving book. And these tragedies take the parents through this kind of fantastical underbelly of New York City where they find secret groups and creatures. Kind of reminded me of Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, but not quite as fantastical as that. It did drag in the middle, like I feel every book does, and there were some awkward parts where it felt like stage direction, or he had the character's name start the sentence like 3 or 4 times in a row. But it was a thriller. It flowed pretty well. It went pretty fast. I am classifying it as a creature feature because there is a troll at the end. That is the beast he is facing. And ultimately, it's about not passing on childhood trauma, which I find interesting because in the Manticore, they talk about Carl Jung, and Carl Jung talks about doing battle with your trolls, which is that exactly. Especially before you have children, it's kind of looking at yourself, looking at your childhood, and being able to stare at these unfortunate beasts in your mind without fear so that you can confront them and you can solve them, which, no surprise, is something that's been on my mind recently. And did this book give me any knowledge as to how to do that? Not really, but it showed this young parent, this fictional young parent, do battle with an actual troll that symbolized all of the childhood trauma that he hopes to not pass down. And somehow that inspires me to do the same. And that's kind of the magic of fiction, to be shown these abstract situations that represent real-world problems but don't give you any tools as to actually solve them, but you just see David slaying Goliath, and somehow that inspires you to figure it out for yourself. Looking at it from the third-person perspective like that, just like real magic, it doesn't seem like it makes sense. It doesn't seem like there's anything there. But there is. If you're watching this, obviously you know that. So again, thank you. I believe it was Night Owl Media for sending me this. Generational trauma has obviously been on my mind, and seeing that troll taken down in a fictional setting, like I just said, is somehow inspiring. Thank you again, and thank you everyone else for watching. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.